We begin this special bulletin with breaking news from Moscow, where Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has submitted his resignation to President Vladimir Putin. Russian media reports Putin plans to name Medvedev as deputy of the Presidential Security Council. On Wednesday, Putin proposed a referendum on amending Russia's constitution to increase the powers of the parliament, including the ability to select the prime minister. Now, the Russian president's term will end in 2024, with the constitution currently requiring him to step down.
I propose on a constitutional level to adopt mandatory requirements for people in positions that are critically important to provision of security and sovereignty of our country, namely heads of federal subjects, members of the Federal Council, parliament members, the Prime Minister, his deputies, federal ministers, heads of other federal bodies, and judges cannot have foreign citizenship, residency, or any other document that allows them to live permanently on the territory of another country.
Let's cross live now to Julia Chapman, who joins us from Moscow. Hi, Julia. Just bring us some clarity, first of all, on what exactly is happening in the Russian government today. Make it clear as well that, Medvedev's resignation is not a resignation in protest of the government, that it is actually part of a reshuffling strategy. Let's put it that way.
It certainly was. This was a highly orchestrated move by President Putin working with Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. And of course, what it means is that there will be a big shakeup of the Russian government, particularly under the constitutional amendments that President Vladimir Putin proposed in his annual address today to the Federal Assembly, the Russian legislature. And in doing so, in resigning from his post as Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, the Prime Minister, has paved the way really to allow possibly President Putin to take over that post in 4 years' time. It's unclear why this move has come at this particular time, because there are still 4 years left in President Putin's presidency of this term. But there has been enormous speculation as to what will come next for President Putin, what he's going to do in 2024, because as you mentioned, he's unable to run for another consecutive presidential term. He's already served 4 after having he served the first 2 from 2000 and then had a break where he took the position of prime minister for 4 years while President Dmitry Medvedev took over as president. And then President Putin returned to the post for 2 extended presidential terms, each of 6 years. And he's got 4 years left on that second presidential term of this bloc. And then, of course, we don't know what's going to happen next. But today we've started to get an indication of what the country might look like after 2024, with President Putin possibly looking to take over the prime ministership once again, or possibly also looking to head the Russian Security Council, a very influential body that advises the president.
Right. Elaborate further, Julia, if you will, on what seems to be another part of a cycle when we saw just over a decade ago the same strange shuffling of the structure of the Russian government so that Dmitry Medvedev could take over for Vladimir Putin, but still allow Vladimir Putin to essentially hold all the strings and stay in power, but under another title.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of government maneuvering going on here. Russia is far from a democratic country. President Putin has been pulling the strings for the last 20 years. It was 20 years ago this year that he first came to power as Russia's president, and he has certainly maintained a grip on power throughout that entire period, even when he was prime minister for 4 years from 2008. Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has been a very loyal subject to President Putin. He served his 1 term as president when it was necessary for President Putin to step down. And President Medvedev stepped down from his presidential term and did not run for a second term, which he was, under the Constitution, certainly allowed to do. And he has allowed President Putin to come back into power for 2 more terms. And so this latest move of his appears to be another step in the right direction for President Putin. It allows him possibly to take over that post of prime minister if he so chooses in 4 years' time. What's going to happen next for Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev? He's going to hold the position for a little bit longer until a new government can be appointed by President Putin, and then he has been offered by President Putin to take the deputy head of the Russian Security Council. So it's unclear whether this is considered a promotion or a demotion for him, but he's certainly doing everything in order to allow President Putin to make his next moves.
And Julie, I mean, it's always risky to stage any sort of anti-government protests in Russia, but do you expect to see any? Will Russians take some risk, those that oppose the government of Vladimir Putin, to come out on the streets and say, that they don't want to tolerate this, what might be seen as a power grab by some?
I think it's unlikely that we'll see anything of that kind anytime soon, but perhaps closer to 2024, there could be further opposition to whatever transition of power takes place if indeed President Putin does take over a role that essentially allows him to maintain his grip on power here in Russia. There could certainly be big protests like we saw in 2012 when he did just that, when he moved from the prime ministership and became president again for what was then the third time. If when he leaves office in 2024, he then goes on to maintain a position of power, there certainly could be some opposition. But in his speech today to the Federal Assembly, he laid out a number of proposals that were aimed at sweetening this, possibly for the Russian people. He introduced new benefits or extended benefits for Russia's poorest families in order to incentivize them to have more children, because Russia faces a very serious demographic problem. And on top of that, he also offered a number of other sweeteners for the Russian people, offering a number of extended incentives. So he was certainly trying to make those incentives very public. There was speculation that he was going to be broadcast across the country on buildings, that his speech was going to be available for all to hear in the streets due to some technical problems that didn't quite pan out for him. But he certainly wanted the people of Russia to hear this speech today. It's not often very widely watched by Russian people, of course, who are going about their business, who are working during the day. But it's certainly one that he wanted them to hear. And I think he will be certainly concerned that there will be some opposition to the transition of power, but it's a while before we see anything very serious.
Okay. Julia Chapman joining us live there from Moscow. Thank you so much for that.